They say the fall of an empire isn't marked by the clash of armies or the flames of cities, but by the silence that follows. The Inca Empire learned this silence in the most brutal way imaginable. Not in the battles against Spanish steel, but in the quiet aftermath, where the fate of Inca women became a shadow history few dared to record. When the conquistadors marched into Pawantinsu, they claimed they came for gold, for glory, for God. But the truth moved more slowly, like a sickness underneath the skin. It began with the taking of land, then the taking of power, and finally the taking of people. And among all those people, none faced a darker fate than the daughters, wives, priestesses, and chosen women of the Inca. In the days before the Spanish came, Inca women held a sacred duality. They were weavers of lineage, guardians of rituals, keepers of the moon's mysteries. Some were a class, chosen women, taken as children to be trained in purity, spirituality, and the highest arts of their culture. They served the sun god. They brewed holy chicha. They wove garments for the Sapa Inca himself, and most of all, they were protected, but protection is a fragile thing. And when the empire broke, everything around them followed. The first cracks were small Spanish soldiers storming villages in search of food and silver, taking captives as payment. Women disappeared, carried away to camps that returned them different, quiet, staring at nothing, refusing to speak of what happened. Then came the demands for tribute. At first, the Spaniards wanted gold. Then they wanted servants. Then they wanted something else entirely. Inca women, whose lives had once been bound to ceremony and honor, were suddenly dragged into a world where their bodies became a bargaining chip for survival. Some were taken as trophies, others as forced concubines. Many were exchanged as currency between soldiers, like objects rather than people. But the darkest fate of all was reserved for the acllas, the sacred women the Spanish called Las Virgenes del Sol. To the conquistadors, the idea of women raised in spiritual purity was not holy, it was tempting. The temples where they lived, once places of silence and sanctity, were looted, burned, turned into barracks. The very walls that once echoed with prayer now echoed with commands and fear. Some acllas were forced into marriages with soldiers. Others were sent across the sea to Spain as servants, never to return home. And the worst were the ones who stayed behind, trapped in buildings the conquistadors repurposed as holding quarters, rooms with no windows, no family, no future. For the Inca, losing purity was a fate worse than death. Not because of physical violation alone, but because purity was tied to the soul, to the afterlife, to the very meaning of existence. To be defiled was not just to be harmed, it was to be cut off from the gods, severed from ancestors, denied spiritual identity. And so, many women chose silence over shame. Some took their own lives rather than face the Spaniards' demands. Others ran into the mountains, joining rebels who fought impossible battles in the shadows. But the cruelty did not end there. When the Spanish introduced the encomienda system, a forced labor regime disguised as civilization, women were assigned to Spanish masters not only as workers, but as property. Some were forced to cook and clean from dawn till night. Others were made to raise the children of their captors. Many bore wounds that could not be seen, carrying trauma like invisible scars. In the cold villages of the Andes, priests conducted forced baptisms, insisting that salvation required obedience. But for many women, baptism wasn't a ritual, it was a threat. Those who resisted were punished. Those who submitted were watched. Their traditions were torn from them, their hair cut, their names replaced with Christian ones. Some were forced into monasteries, not to worship, but to be reshaped, molded into docile servants taught to forget their ancestry. The Spanish claimed this was mercy. To the Inca, it was spiritual death. But the darkest truth of all was something history tried to bury. The Spanish believed that conquering a people required more than breaking their armies. It required breaking their mothers, their daughters, their wives. Because if the women fell, so did the bloodline, so did the memory, so did the future. Conquistadors wrote proudly to the Spanish crown about how many Inca women they had taken as wives. They used the word wife the way one uses the word spoil. They fathered children and refused to acknowledge them. They fractured families, severed dynasties, destroyed traditions that had survived for centuries. Some Inca noblewomen were forced into political marriages with Spaniards. To the outside world, these unions looked like alliances. But inside the homes where they lived, the truth was far darker. These women were hostages wearing jewelry, prisoners who smiled because they had no other choice. In the Andes today, there are villages where stories still linger, stories whispered by grandmothers whose great-grandmothers survived those days. Stories of soldiers who rode into towns at night, demanding daughters as gifts, stories of a class who vanished without trace. Stories of mixed children raised to believe their mother's people were savages. Stories of women who were punished for resisting and women who were punished for surviving, and yet, even in the deepest darkness, the Inca spirit remained. Some women escaped into the mountains and joined the Neo-Inca resistance led by Manco Inca. They carried messages, smuggled food, hid rebels, whispered warnings through the villages. In their silence, they fought. In their endurance, they resisted. Others preserved songs and prayers in secret, teaching them to their daughters at night, keeping alive threads of a world the Spaniards tried to erase. They wove patterns into cloth that carried forbidden stories. They hid symbols of the sun god Inti inside Christian crosses. They embedded their rebellion into the fabric of daily life. The Spanish broke many bodies, but they could never fully break the Inca soul. There are ruins in Peru where walls still stand, built so precisely that even earthquakes cannot tear them apart. Those walls are like the women who endured that age, scarred, battered, changed forever, but still standing. History remembers kings and conquerors, but the true story of empires is written in the suffering of those who could not fight back. Inca women were not victims. They were survivors of a cruelty the world still refuses to fully acknowledge. And perhaps the bitterest truth is this: the weapons the Spanish used were not swords or guns or armor. They were fear, control, shame, power wrapped in piety. Civilization used as a mask for destruction. Death would have been merciful. Instead, Inca women endured something far worse. They lost everything except their will to continue. And that will, quiet, stubborn, unbroken, remains the reason their culture survives today. Long after the empire fell, long after the conquistadors carved their names into the Andes with steel and fire, the suffering of Inca women did not fade. It changed shape. It grew quieter, sharper, more insidious. What had begun with violence became something even more destructive, a shadow woven into everyday life, a wound carried for generations. And in this shadow, the memory of what the Spanish did to Inca women took on a new, bitter truth, one that lingered long after the last battle was fought. The early years after conquest were the cruelest. Villages once sheltered by mountains now trembled each time a rider approached. The sound of hooves on stone became a warning, a reminder of the power Spaniards held. And the women, daughters of priests, widows of warriors, sisters of rebels, learned to stay indoors, learned to silence their footsteps, learned to hide their children when soldiers came to collect taxes that were never paid in coin. Some women were forced to carry heavy jars of chicha to Spanish garrisons. Others were made to weave clothing for soldiers, intricate patterns that once held sacred meaning now repurposed as trophies for men who could not read the symbols. The acllas, the chosen women, were stripped of their roles entirely. They were no longer daughters of the sun. They were laborers, servants, captives placed in convent-like institutions that served Spain's plans, not Inti's will. Some were sent to Spanish households as domestic helpers, but they were more than helpers. They were living property, expected to obey, expected to serve, expected to bear the weight of two worlds crushing in around them. The Spaniards claimed they came to save souls, but the souls they saved were the ones they broke first. The new laws banned Inca rituals, declaring them devil worship. Women who brewed sacred chicha for ceremonies were beaten. Women who sang ancestral hymns in the fields were punished. Mothers who braided traditional patterns into their daughters' hair were told it was rebellion. The punishment was often worse than death, humiliation, public shaming, erasure of identity. There were women who resisted quietly, teaching their children Inca words only at night. And there were those who resisted loudly, joining rebellions, smuggling messages, hiding fugitives. These women became targets of the new colonial order. The Spanish commander in Cusco once wrote that Inca women deceive like serpents. They hide messages in their clothing, in their hair, in their songs. He was right. Their defiance was everywhere, woven into their sleeves, whispered into their prayers, carved into their grief. But for every act of resistance, the punishments hardened. In some regions, Spanish officials created what they called corregimiento selection, a ritual where noble Inca women were taken from their families to be supervised by Spanish authority. It was presented as protection, but families knew what it meant. Wives vanished into colonial households. Daughters became wards of the crown. Priestesses were reassigned to monasteries where they were forced to abandon everything that once defined them. The acllas, once the purest symbols of Inca divinity, were destroyed in the most symbolic way possible. Their homes became Spanish lodges. Their purity became a mockery. The sun's daughters were taught new prayers, new languages, new expectations. And the ones who resisted most, were punished in ways history barely recorded. There is a letter written by an Inca nobleman to the Spanish crown in 1542. He wrote, "What they do to our women, even the earth cries to hold their footsteps. They are alive, but not living. They walk, but without spirit." The Spanish dismissed his complaint as native exaggeration, but the truth was far worse. The Inca women taken into Spanish households lived in a limbo. They were neither free nor enslaved, a category the Spaniards invented because they needed labor, but could not legally justify enslavement of baptized women. So they created another word, obligadas, obligated to obey, obligated to serve, obligated to bear children they never chose, obligated to smile in a language they did not speak. For many, this obligation broke something deeper than the body. It broke lineage. Spanish men who fathered children with Inca women rarely claimed them. The children grew up caught between two worlds, accepted by neither. The Spanish saw them as lesser. Some Inca saw them as reminders of humiliation. These children became the embodiment of conquest, living proof of the empire's destruction. There were villages where women refused to touch their newborns because they believed Spanish blood cursed the child. Other villages raised these children fiercely, determined to protect them from the shame their fathers created. And in the highlands, where Spanish power struggled to reach, some families hid children whose fathers were conquistadors, fearing both the Spanish and their own community. The pain of conquest seeped into every aspect of Inca womanhood. Even marriage became a battlefield. Spanish officials imposed European marriage laws, invalidating Inca customs. Many women were forced to marry men they did not know simply to obtain legal protection. But the protection was a lie. Husbands claimed land the women inherited. Priests controlled their confessions. Colonial judges refused to hear their grievances. To resist was to risk everything: family, freedom, identity, but some resisted anyway. There were Inca women who led rebellions disguised as religious processions. Others poisoned Spanish horses rather than let soldiers ride into their villages. Some hid weapons in their shawls, their clothing becoming armor in a silent war. A few women disguised themselves as mail messengers, running between rebel strongholds at night. The Spanish wrote reports calling these women dangerous, deceitful, vengeful, but those words were confessions, not of the women, but of the fear the Spanish felt toward them. Because the one thing the conquistadors could never control was the Inca spirit. Even in captivity, Inca women carried the memory of the empire in their blood. They knew the old prayers. They carried the old names. They whispered the old gods. In those whispers lived defiance. In those whispers lived survival. The Spanish could seize temples and gold, but they could not seize the resilience of a mother teaching her daughter the forbidden stories under the cover of night. They could not silence the songs sung in Quechua during harvests. They could not unweave the symbols hidden in blankets, symbols that told the story of a world before conquest, symbols the Spanish believed were decorative, never realizing they were coded rebels' messages. And while some women broke, others became iron. In the decades that followed the fall of Cusco, Entire networks of Inca women organized resistance through communication invisible to the Spanish. They shared information through weaving patterns, flowers left in specific formations, songs sung in minor changes of rhythm. One colonial governor once reported, "We have crushed the warriors, we have crushed the nobles, but the women, they are dangerous. They hold the old world in their silence." He wasn't wrong. The most powerful rebellions of the 16th century began with whispers carried by women, not warriors. Some rebellions lasted months, some lasted years. One of them, led by Manco Inca in the jungles of Vilcabamba, lasted decades, fueled in large part by women who refused to let the empire die. The Spanish could burn villages. They could take captives. They could rewrite laws. But they could not stop the truth from traveling, because Inca women made sure it did. And yet, the bitterness remained. Generations of forced marriages, violated traditions, broken bloodlines, stolen daughters. This was the silent weight passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter. To survive was its own kind of punishment. To remember was another. To live on after everything was taken was worse than death itself. And in that survival, scarred, stubborn, unbroken, lies the true legacy of Inca women. They are the reason the culture still breathes. History says the empire fell in 1533, but for Inca women, the empire fell again and again, in kitchens where Spanish orders echoed, in churches where their gods were forbidden, in homes where daughters learned to fear the footsteps of foreign men. The conquest did not end with the execution of Atahualpa. It continued in the quiet places, the unseen places, the intimate corners of everyday life where the true suffering took root. For many Inca women, survival meant navigating a world where every path led toward danger. Spanish priests demanded confessions of sins the women did not understand. Colonial judges punished them for laws they did not choose. Spanish soldiers claimed hospitality as a right, turning Inca households into places of constant threat. They were watched. They were judged, they were controlled, and yet they were expected to smile. In the years that followed the conquest, the bitterness grew. Whole families were displaced from ancestral homes and forced into Spanish-style towns known as reducciones. It was here that the cruelest transformation occurred, where Inca women were reshaped into something the Spanish found useful. Many were forced into textile workshops, locked for long hours weaving clothing for the colonial elite, their fingers bleeding as they recreated patterns the Spanish did not understand but greedily admired. The weavings were no longer ceremonial. They were commodities. But the women knew something the Spanish did not. Textiles could speak. So they answered the conquest in color and thread. Wounds hidden in weavings. Anger hidden in knots. Stories hidden in symbols the Spanish believed were decorative. These weavings traveled everywhere, across the Andes, across settlements, across mines, across merchant routes. They were blankets, clothing, shawls, and also messages. Messages the Spanish never realized they carried, warnings passed between villages disguised as fabric. Resistance had changed shape, but it had not died. In the highlands, things were worse. Spanish priests began campaigns to stamp out Inca religion. Temples were burned, idols smashed, rituals banned. Women who had once served as priestesses were forced to kneel before altars of saints they did not know, reciting prayers they did not believe. Some complied quietly, some hardened inwardly. Others hid the old gods in plain sight. A stone placed in a corner, a bowl of water left on a windowsill. A whisper to the mountains before dawn. To the Spanish, these gestures meant nothing. To the Inca, these gestures kept the world alive. But not all stories were of quiet rebellion, some were darker. There were villages where entire generations of women were taken for labor in Spanish estates, where they were forced to cook, clean, wash, nurse, and serve. Some returned home years later hollowed out, older in spirit than in flesh. Some never returned. The cruelty was so widespread that Spanish courts were flooded with cases of abuse against indigenous women, yet almost none ended in justice. When an Inca woman accused a Spaniard of assault or exploitation, the court dismissed her testimony, claiming she did not understand Christian morality. The truth was simpler. A conquered woman's pain did not matter in a world built by conquerors. In the silver mines of Potosi, the richest mine on earth, the suffering intensified. Women were forced to haul water, cook for miners, wash ore, and live in conditions so brutal that many died young. But for the Inca, the mines were more than death. They were believed to be places where Spanish greed opened the earth's wound, unbalancing the spiritual world. Women near Potosi whispered that the mountain itself cried at night, that the spirits of the miners wandered at dusk, that those who served the Spanish near its mouth were touched by a curse, a grief so deep it stole their dreams. Whether curse or trauma, the effect was real. Many Inca women in mining regions died not from violence but from despair. But despair was not the only inheritance. Something else grew in the shadows of the conquest, something fierce. By the late 1500s, Spanish records began mentioning a troubling pattern: women encouraging their sons and husbands to rebel, women refusing to convert, women poisoning Spanish food, women hiding fugitives in their homes, women accompanying rebel messengers into the mountains. Colonial governors wrote panicked letters to the crown saying, "It is the women who keep the Inca spirit alive. They are the thread we cannot cut," and they were right. In the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II, nearly 250 years after the conquest, Inca women played a central role. They carried weapons disguised as bundles of cloth. They gave coded signals from hillside fires. They intercepted Spanish supply routes. They recited stories of the old empire to keep the men fighting. And when the rebellion failed, the Spanish executed women with the same brutality they used for warriors. But even in defeat, something had changed. The Spanish finally understood the truth. To break the Inca, they would have to break the women. And they couldn't, not completely. Not ever. Because the deepest form of defiance is survival. That was the secret of Inca women, a resilience so quiet, so stubborn, so rooted in the earth that centuries of conquest could not uproot it. Their suffering had been unspeakable, their trauma generational, their losses immeasurable. But through everything, they refused to vanish. And that refusal carried consequences the Spanish never predicted. It was Inca women who preserved the Quechua language. It was Inca women who continued the ancient weaving traditions. It was Inca women who protected the stories of creation of the sun god of Pachamama. It was Inca women who hid the songs of the ancestors inside lullabies for their children. The Spanish built churches over temples. Inca women built memory over pain. And memory lasts longer than stone. So, when historians say the Spanish destroyed the Inca Empire, they speak only of the state, the crown, the nobility, the armies. What they do not understand is that culture does not die when rulers fall. It dies when women forget, and Inca women did not forget. They carried the empire inside themselves. In their footsteps on mountain paths, in their stories whispered at night, in their weavings dyed with the colors of the Andes, in their prayers disguised as Catholic hymns, in every child they raised with a name the Spanish could not pronounce. Their suffering was immense. Their trauma was profound. Their fear was constant. But their endurance was greater than all of it. And that is the bitter truth behind the conquest. The Spanish wanted to destroy the Inca world. Instead, they created a generation of women whose pain became the foundation of survival. Women who buried their dead with trembling hands. Women who walked through conquered streets with broken pride. Women who endured humiliation that felt worse than death. Women who lived on not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. And in their survival, the Inca world learned to breathe again. Even today, in the markets of Cusco, you can see them, descendants of those same women, weaving cloths filled with symbols the Spanish never deciphered. You can hear their language, their songs, their laughter, the very things meant to be erased. Their survival is the final punishment the Spanish never intended. Because empires fall. Legions crumble, conquerors die. But the people who endure, the women who carry a world forward despite the ashes, they are the true victors of history. And that is why the story of Inca women does not end with conquest. It ends with a truth stronger than suffering. They lived, they remembered, they endured. And through them, the empire never truly died.